You learn who a man really is in the moment he decides not to step in. Ethan Cole stood under the harsh fluorescent light of a downtown Boston parking garage, rain dripping off the concrete above him, and watched a young woman lose the last pieces of her life in less than 20 minutes. First came the paper coffee cup, still warm, slipping from Clare Bennett's hand and bursting across the sidewalk in a thin brown splash. Then came the call from her manager, loud enough through her cracked phone speaker for even a stranger 10 feet away to hear the rehearsed, impersonal words. They were letting her go, effective immediately. And no, there would be no final shift, no cash tips waiting in an envelope, no second chance. Claire stood there in her thrift store coat, rain darkening the shoulders, blinking like maybe if she held still enough the words would rearrange themselves into something survivable. They did not. A minute later, her landlord called. Ethan did not hear every word, only enough to see the color drain from her face as she reached her apartment building across the street, climbed the 3 chipped front steps, and found a yellow notice taped flat against the door like a verdict. She tried the knob once, then twice, her fingers shaking, then pressed her forehead to the wood for one small, silent second before stepping back. By the time she dragged her suitcase to the curb, one wheel wobbling, rain had soaked through the hem of her jeans and turned the cardboard box in her arms soft at the corners. People passed her without slowing. A man in a navy pea coat glanced up from his umbrella just long enough to judge the scene, then kept moving. A woman in running shoes veered around the suitcase like it was a puddle. Somewhere down the block, a siren wailed and faded. A city bus sighed at the corner. The wind smelled like wet pavement, engine exhaust, and the bitter roast from the cafe that had just fired her. Ethan stayed where he was, dressed like the kind of man no one ever remembered, in scuffed work boots and a dark canvas jacket, invisible by design. He was supposed to be doing a field inspection at one of his company's properties 2 blocks over, not memorizing the look on a stranger's face. But then Claire, crouched beside her box, lifted out a framed photo, a worn sketchbook, and a pharmacy envelope, and with careful hands that had every reason to be angry, she covered the box with her own coat, because the things inside mattered more than staying warm. That was when Ethan understood this was not just a rough day. This was the day she started disappearing in plain sight, and for reasons he could not yet explain, he could not look away. By the time Claire reached South Station, the rain had faded into a cold mist that clung to everything, and Boston had taken on that washed-out evening look that made every light seem farther away than it was. Her suitcase rattled over the cracked sidewalk, the bad will catching every few feet, and she kept one hand pressed over the top of the cardboard box in her arms, as if she could still protect what little was left by holding it tighter. Inside the station, the heat was thin and uneven, rising in tired waves from old vents, carrying the smell of burnt coffee, damp wool, and the salty edge of winter coats that had been caught in the rain too many times. Claire stopped near a pharmacy kiosk, reached into her pocket, and counted her money under the pale overhead light. One $20 bill, 2 singles, a few quarters. Ethan stood across the concourse beside a newspaper stand, half hidden by a column, close enough to see her mouth press into a line when she looked at the prices on the shelf. She stared at a travel-sized toothbrush, then at a bottle of water, then at a cup of instant soup behind a fogged glass warmer. For a moment, it looked like hunger was about to decide for her. Then she heard it. A dry, stubborn cough from the bench behind her, the kind that caught in the chest and would not let go. Claire turned and saw an older woman wrapped in a thin gray coat, shoulders trembling, one hand clutched around a bus ticket and the other pressed to her throat. The woman tried to wave it off with an embarrassed smile when Claire asked if she was all right, but another cough folded the answer in half. Claire looked back at the shelf, at the bottle of water, at the cup of soup, and then down at the 20 in her hand. Ethan watched her shut her eyes for 1 second, not dramatic, not theatrical, just tired enough to make the choice hurt. Then she stepped up to the counter and bought cough medicine, a bottle of water, and a small pack of crackers. The cashier slid the items across, and the thin receipt nearly slipped from Claire's fingers. She carried them to the bench, knelt in front of the woman without a trace of pity in her face, and said, soft as rain on glass, "Here, please take this. You sound like you need it more than I do." The woman protested. Claire smiled anyway. "I am still standing," she said. "That has to mean something." Ethan felt something in his chest pull tight as the older woman accepted the medicine with shaking hands. Claire folded the receipt and tucked it into the front pocket of her sketchbook before sitting down at the far end of the bench with nothing for herself except the cold, her box of keepsakes, and a dignity that somehow looked warmer than a coat. An hour later, the station had settled into that uneasy nighttime hush that never really felt quiet, just softer around the edges, with rolling suitcase wheels humming across tile, distant train announcements blurring into one another, and the neon glow from the sandwich counter painting the floor in pale red and gold. Claire stayed on the bench until the older woman boarded her bus, then stood, adjusted the handle of her broken suitcase, and headed toward the street with the careful, measured steps of someone determined not to fall apart where strangers could see. Ethan followed at a distance, hands in his jacket pockets, his work badge turned inward, telling himself he had practical reasons to keep heading the same way. South End was on his way back to the garage. The shelter on Harrison Avenue was one of the properties his foundation supported. Any of those explanations might have worked, except none of them felt true. Outside, the air had sharpened. The rain was gone, but the cold had settled in harder, slipping beneath collars and into sleeves. Claire crossed 2 blocks under streetlights that flickered against wet pavement, her cardboard box balanced against her hip, her sketchbook tucked under one arm now that the box had begun to sag. At the corner of a closed florist shop, a gust of wind rushed down the street and caught the top of the box. A framed photo slid loose, then a folded pharmacy receipt, then the sketchbook itself, falling open as it hit the sidewalk. Claire gasped and dropped to her knees at once, trying to gather everything before the wind could carry it farther. Ethan reached it first. He bent, one gloved hand closing over the sketchbook just as the pages flipped wildly beneath the streetlight. And then he stopped moving. The drawing on the open page was not casual or rushed. It was detailed enough to feel remembered rather than imagined. A narrow brick building with tall front windows, a reading room on the first floor, apartments above, and a small garden along the side wrapped in iron fencing. Across the top, written in neat pencil, were the words Rose House. Ethan stared at the page as the city noise dulled around him. His mother had used that name for years when she talked about the project she never got to build. Rose House had been her unfinished dream, a housing and literacy center she had planned before illness took the time she needed to build it. He had seen the original concept sketches in a flat file cabinet in her study, had traced those same window lines with his finger when he was 16, had not heard that name spoken out loud in nearly a decade. In the bottom corner of Claire's drawing, almost hidden by a rain smear, was a smaller line in cursive that made his pulse catch even harder. For Mom. We still remember. Claire rose in front of him, breath visible in the cold, and for the first time that night Ethan was not looking at a stranger who had lost everything. He was looking at someone tied to the one part of his life money had never been able to fix. For one suspended second, neither of them spoke. The wind tugged at the loose strands of Claire's hair, lifting them across her cheek, and the traffic light at the corner clicked from green to yellow, then red, throwing changing color across the wet street, while Ethan stood there with her sketchbook open in his hands like he had accidentally reached into a room from his old life and found the light still on. Claire stepped forward first, breath clouding in the cold. "That is mine," she said, not sharp, not rude, just tired in the way people sound when they have already had too much taken from them for one day. Ethan closed the cover at once and handed it back carefully, making sure the bent corner did not catch on his glove. "Sorry," he said. "The wind got there before you did." She took it, checked the front pocket to make sure the folded receipt was still inside, then slid the sketchbook tight against her chest with the kind of instinct people have around their last valuable thing. Up close, he could see that her eyes were blue-gray, the color of harbor water under cloud cover, and that the rain had left tiny crystals of cold on her lashes. "Thank you," she said after a moment, and the words came out quieter than before, as if even gratitude cost her something now, and she still offered it anyway. Ethan glanced at the sagging box in her arms, the broken suitcase wheel, the framed photo with water creeping beneath the glass. "There is a shelter 2 blocks south," he said. "Warm beds fill up fast this time of night." Claire gave a small nod that said she already knew and wished she did not. They started walking in the same direction, not exactly together at first, but no longer as strangers either, their footsteps falling into a rhythm on the slick sidewalk. At the next corner, the sign over the community center across the street glowed faintly through the dark. Evening kitchen, volunteers needed. Ethan stopped. They always need an extra pair of hands after 9, he said. Sometimes they let volunteers eat after service. Claire looked at the sign, then at him, suspicion flickering across her face in a thin, understandable line. How do you know that? She asked. Ethan lifted one shoulder. I help out here sometimes after site visits. It was true, just not in the way she would assume. She studied him for another second, taking in the scuffed boots, the plain canvas jacket, the inward-turned work badge clipped to his pocket. To her, he looked like a man who spent his days on job sites, not in corner offices, and not someone whose name sat on office towers and foundation letters all over the city. You do not have to keep helping, she said. I am not asking. Ethan met her eyes. I know. Something in that answer seemed to settle her. They crossed together, the signal chirping them forward, and when they stepped inside the center, warm air wrapped around them carrying the smell of tomato soup, industrial coffee, and dish soap. Somewhere in the back, metal pans clattered. A radio played low near the sink. The woman at the volunteer desk looked up over her glasses and said they were short one server and one dishwasher. Claire opened her mouth, probably to offer the dishwasher job because it was the invisible one, but Ethan spoke first. Give her the serving line, he said. I will take the sink. Claire turned to him with surprise, and for the first time that night, the corners of her mouth almost lifted. It was not quite a smile, but it was close enough to feel like a door unlocking. Ethan took the rubber apron from the hook, rolled his sleeves, and watched her step behind the steam table with her sketchbook tucked safely on the highest shelf by the register. He still had not told her who he was. He still had no plan for when he would. But as she reached for a ladle, straightened her shoulders, and greeted the first guest in line with a kindness she had no practical reason left to offer, Ethan realized he was not just stepping closer to a mystery from his past. He was stepping into the orbit of a woman who kept choosing decency when the world had given her every reason to stop. By the end of the shift, steam had fogged the stainless steel sinks. Claire smelled faintly of tomato soup and dish soap, and the cold, jagged panic that had followed her since the afternoon had softened into something quieter, not safety exactly, but a pause long enough to breathe. She stayed after the last tray was stacked, helping wipe down counters with the same steady focus she had used on the serving line, as if useful work could keep grief from catching up. Ethan watched her from the sink, sleeves damp, hands red from hot water, and noticed the small details no one else would have thought to notice. The way she slipped half a dinner roll into a paper napkin for later, instead of eating it at once. The way she checked the shelf twice to make sure her sketchbook was still there. The way she thanked every person who handed her anything, even a rag, even a plastic cup, as though gratitude had become part of her muscle memory. When the volunteer coordinator offered Claire a cot in the women's dorm upstairs and asked if she could come back in the morning to help sort donations, relief flashed across her face, so quickly it was almost painful to see. Yes, she said. Yes, absolutely. Ethan should have left then. His phone still held 6 missed calls from a board member and 2 from legal, and tomorrow morning he was supposed to review an acquisition package involving several aging buildings in South Boston. Instead, he walked out into the cold and sat in his car with the engine off, the city lights blurred across the windshield, while one question kept rising above the others. Why would a woman who had just been fired, locked out, and pushed to the edge still carry a drawing labeled Rose House? He did not sleep much. At 6:30 the next morning, with dawn spreading pale silver over brick rooftops and church steeples, Ethan was in the back seat scrolling through property records on his tablet, no longer looking at Claire's misfortune as a coincidence. Her building address pulled up fast. The owner was listed under a limited liability company he had never heard of, but one layer down, then another. The trail led somewhere familiar enough to make his jaw tighten. The same holding group had been circling distressed rental properties in neighborhoods his company had recently flagged for redevelopment interest. Low-cost acquisitions, fast turnover, quiet evictions disguised as policy. He searched Clare Bennett next. There was not much online. A portfolio page with student sketches from 3 years earlier. An old fundraiser flyer listing her mother, Martha Bennett, as a volunteer coordinator for a literacy project partnered with the late Evelyn Cole Foundation. Ethan stared at the screen until the words seemed to sharpen on their own. Martha Bennett. He remembered the name now, not from headlines or donor galas, but from his mother's voice at the dining room table, speaking warmly about a woman who could organize a room, calm a crisis, and still make time to read to children on Saturday mornings. By 8 o'clock, Ethan had called his chief of staff and told her to quietly pull employment records from the cafe where Claire worked, tenant complaints from her building, and any correspondence linked to the holding company. No alerts, no official requests yet, he said. I do not want anyone cleaning this up before I see it. A few minutes later, his chief of staff called back. The landlord posted a non-payment notice 48 hours early, she said. Ethan looked up at the community center entrance and saw Claire stepping out into the new morning with her coat buttoned to the throat, a paper cup of coffee warming her hands, and a borrowed name tag pinned slightly crooked over her heart. She looked tired. She also looked determined in a way that made the whole city seem smaller around her. Ethan got out of the car, crossed the sidewalk, and held the door for her as if he had just happened to be there. Claire blinked in surprise, then smiled. This time for real, small and bright, and gone too quickly. You came back, she said. Ethan returned the look with one of his own. So did you. She had not just carried his mother's dream through the rain. She had grown up around it. And somewhere beneath the ordinary exchange, beneath the coffee steam and the morning traffic and the careful disguises both visible and invisible, the first threads of something larger began to pull into place. By noon, the community center had settled into its weekday rhythm, donation bins rolling across scuffed linoleum, volunteers calling out sizes from the clothing room, the copier humming near the office, and Claire moving through all of it with a kind of quiet determination that almost made her exhaustion look steady. She sorted canned food, folded winter coats, carried boxes up one flight of stairs, and never once asked for anything except where to put the next load. Ethan stayed close enough to be useful and far enough not to crowd her, taking the heavier boxes when she reached for them, fixing a jammed supply cart, refilling the coffee station before anyone had to mention it. Around noon, the coordinator sent Claire to deliver intake forms to the shelter office upstairs, and for the first time all morning Ethan had a clear hour to keep digging. He stepped outside into the sharp March sunlight, pulled out his phone, and called the chief of staff who had been unraveling the threads since dawn. Her voice came through clean and efficient over the traffic noise. You were right, she said. The point-of-sale logs show tip shortages across 3 weekends, but camera stills placed the night manager at the register after closing. He filed the complaint against Claire the same morning the cafe's lease renegotiation stalled. Ethan slowed on the sidewalk. And the apartment? The landlord posted a non-payment notice 48 hours early. There is also an internal email from the holding company asking for accelerated vacancy in 6 units, including hers. They want the building cleared before inspection. Quietly, Ethan looked back through the center's front window and saw Claire at the copy machine, head bent, one hand smoothing paper into a neat stack. A bus roared past, shaking cold air down the block, but he barely felt it. So she was pushed, he said. From both sides. It looks coordinated, his chief of staff replied. Not dramatic enough to make headlines, just enough pressure to make someone disappear quietly. He ended the call and stood still for a moment, the city moving around him in bright, ordinary pieces while the shape of it became painfully clear. Claire had not fallen through cracks. People had widened them. That afternoon, he found the second piece in a file his legal team sent over from the archives of his mother's foundation. Martha Bennett had worked with Evelyn Cole on the original Rose House proposal 9 years earlier, organizing neighborhood reading nights, housing referrals, and after-school art workshops before funding dried up after Evelyn's illness. Attached to the old proposal was a grainy event photo from a church basement in Dorchester. Martha was smiling into the camera, and beside her, younger by years and softer around the eyes, stood Ethan's mother. At the edge of the frame, maybe 15 years old, holding a sketch pad almost too big for her arms, was Claire. Ethan stared at the image until memory and present tense fused into one long ache. She had not just carried his mother's dream through the rain. She had been part of it long before he understood that. When he went back upstairs, Claire was pinning fresh labels onto supply shelves, her borrowed name tags still slightly crooked, her hair slipping loose from behind one ear. You look like you found bad news, she said without turning, as if she could hear the weight in his footsteps alone. Ethan stopped beside the shelf, close enough to smell cardboard, coffee, and the faint clean scent of laundry soap from her coat. Maybe not bad, he said carefully. Maybe just the kind that explains too much. Claire looked at him then, blue-gray eyes steady, guarded, intelligent. That sounds worse. Ethan almost smiled, because she was right. Across the room, a volunteer laughed at something near the coat rack, and a radio switched songs, but between them the air held still. He knew more now than he had the night before. He knew she had been cornered, lied about, and quietly erased by people who expected no one important would notice. He also knew the most dangerous truth was the one he still had not said aloud, that someone important had noticed, and he was standing right in front of her pretending to be ordinary while deciding how to expose the whole thing without using her as collateral. The reveal came the next morning dressed as something harmless. Claire had just finished stacking donated towels in the upstairs supply room when the coordinator appeared in the doorway holding a clipboard and said a downtown foundation wanted to meet one of the shelter volunteers about a paid community support role, temporary at first, but with real hours and benefits if it worked out. Claire laughed once under her breath, not because it was funny, but because life had trained her to distrust good timing. "You probably want someone with a cleaner week than mine," she said. The coordinator only smiled and told her the appointment had already been arranged. An hour later, Claire stood in the lobby of Cole Urban Group with her sketchbook tucked under one arm, her thrift store coat buttoned all the way up, and a visitor badge clipped to her sweater. Everything around her looked polished to the point of intimidation. Marble floors shining under warm recessed lights, quiet elevators gliding behind brushed steel doors, a wall of glass looking out over Boston Harbor like the whole city had been framed on purpose. She had almost turned around twice on the ride over. By the time the receptionist led her toward the executive conference room, her palms were cold in spite of the heat. Then the doors opened, and the room changed shape around her. In an instant, Ethan was already inside, not in the canvas jacket, not with rolled sleeves and dishwater on his hands. He stood at the far end of the long walnut table in a charcoal suit that fit him with effortless precision, white shirt crisp at the collar, city light catching at the silver watch on his wrist. Two attorneys sat to his left. A woman Claire vaguely recognized from local business coverage stood near the screen with a tablet. And on the wall behind him, in quiet brass letters, was the name she had somehow never connected to the man himself until that impossible second. Ethan Cole, Chief Executive Officer. Claire stopped so hard the receptionist nearly walked into her. The room went perfectly still. Ethan took one step forward. "Claire." It was the same voice, and somehow that made it worse. She looked at him as if the last 2 days were rearranging themselves into something she could no longer trust. The soup line, the shelter door, the quiet advice, the steady eyes. None of it disappeared, but all of it changed shape. "You," she said softly, and then again, stronger this time. "You are Ethan Cole." It was not a question. Ethan nodded once. "Yes." Claire let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, except there was no humor in it at all. She glanced around the room, at the polished table, the skyline, the tailored strangers waiting with professional patience, then back at the man who had watched her count coins in a train station and never said a word. Color rose into her face, not from embarrassment alone, but from the awful heat of being seen too clearly while knowing too little in return. "So what was this?" she asked. "Research." Ethan opened his mouth, but Claire did not let him reach for the easy answer. "Did you stand there and watch me lose my job because it helped you understand the situation? Did you follow me to a shelter because I was part of some story you wanted to understand?" Her voice did not rise. That was what made every word land harder. "I told you things because I thought you were just a man trying to help, not someone deciding how much of the truth I was allowed to know." Ethan's expression changed, the practiced control slipping just enough to show something unguarded beneath it. "I was trying to help." Claire shook her head, eyes bright now, though she refused to let a single tear fall. "No, you were deciding when to stop pretending." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the faint hum of the projector against the wall. Ethan took another step closer, but not enough to corner her. "Claire, I did not bring you here to embarrass you." She lifted her chin. "Then why am I here?" He looked at her for one long second, and when he answered, the room seemed to narrow around the truth. Because what happened to you was not an accident, and because the moment I saw that drawing of Rose House, I knew this was no longer just business. Claire did not sit down. She stayed near the end of the conference table with one hand wrapped around her sketchbook, as if it were the only solid thing left in the room, while Ethan nodded to the woman with the tablet. The screen behind him came to life, and with it the official version of what happened to her began to unravel. Time-stamped register logs from the cafe appeared first, followed by still images from the security feed. The night manager, not Claire, stood at the open drawer after closing, slipping cash into an apron pocket while the system remained signed in under her name. Then came internal emails from the holding company that owned her building, messages stripped of every human word until they read like instructions for clearing old furniture. Accelerate vacancy, avoid formal dispute, apply pressure before inspection. Claire stared at the screen, and for a moment all the polished air left the room. She had known she had been treated unfairly. Knowing and seeing were not the same thing. They did this on purpose to force me out, she said, and the softness in her voice made it land harder than anger would have. Ethan did not look away. Yes. One of the attorneys slid a folder across the table toward her. Inside were printouts, affidavits in progress, and a formal notice stating that legal action had already begun against the manager who filed the false complaint and the holding company that moved to force her out early. There was also a short letter on heavy cream paper bearing the Cole Urban logo, confirming that her termination record would be corrected through direct action with the cafe owner once the fraud evidence was filed. Claire touched the edge of the page but did not lift it. So this is why I am here, she said. To watch rich people fix what other rich people broke. Ethan exhaled slowly, as if he had expected that and knew he deserved part of it. No, he said. You are here because I do not want to hand you a settlement and call it justice. He turned to the screen again. The next image was not evidence. It was a digital rendering of a brick building with tall front windows, a reading room glowing on the first floor, apartments above, and a side garden traced in spring green. Across the top, in serif letters, were the words Rose House. Claire went still. Ethan's voice changed when he spoke, dropping into something more personal than executive calm. My mother never stopped talking about Martha Bennett. She said your mother knew how to turn a plan into a place people could breathe inside. After my mother got sick, Rose House died in a file cabinet before it ever had the chance to become real. You kept drawing it anyway. Claire swallowed, her eyes fixed on the screen. My mother thought it mattered, she said. She thought places like that could keep people from disappearing. Ethan gave one small nod. She was right. He reached into the folder at his seat and drew out the rain-smudged photocopy of Claire's sketch, the one from the street, now carefully flattened behind a clear sleeve. Beside it, he placed the thin pharmacy receipt she had tucked into the sketchbook after buying cough medicine with her last $20. The sight of that flimsy piece of paper in a boardroom full of glass and steel nearly undid her. This, Ethan said quietly, is why I am doing this the way I am. Not charity. Not a rescue story that makes me look noble. Our legal team has already begun preparing the filings, whether you ever speak to me again or not. We are already moving to correct your record, whether you forgive me or not. But the project itself should not belong to me alone. He slid one final document across the table. Offer of employment. Founding creative director, Rose House Initiative. Full salary, full benefits. And real decision-making authority written in plain language, not buried in fine print. I am reopening Rose House through the foundation as transitional housing, a neighborhood library, and a community art studio, he said. Claire looked from the paper to Ethan, to the harbor shining beyond the glass, to the sketch of a place she had carried through the rain like memory itself. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled only once. I will not be your gratitude project. Ethan's answer came without hesitation. You are part of the reason this deserves to exist, and the right person to help lead it. 6 months later, the front windows of Rose House caught the late afternoon sun and threw warm light across the sidewalk, so warm that from the street the whole building looked less like a project and more like a promise finally kept. The brick had been cleaned, the iron fence repaired, the garden along the side planted with early spring roses that were just beginning to open, pale blush against dark green leaves. Inside, the first floor held exactly what Claire had drawn all those years ago, and then redrawn through rain and grief and stubborn hope. A reading room with wide armchairs, low shelves for children, long tables for tutoring, and soft lamps that made the whole place feel calm, warm, and unmistakably safe. Upstairs, the transitional apartments were full for the first time, quiet doors with new brass numbers and clean keys, each one opening to a bed, a desk, and a chance to start over without having to beg for the dignity of it. On the far wall of the lobby, framed under museum glass, hung the rain-smudged sketch that had fallen open on the sidewalk the night Ethan found it. He had wanted the original curl and the paper preserved, the softened pencil lines, even the faint mark where the pharmacy receipt had once been tucked into the pocket. Claire had argued that it was imperfect. Ethan had looked at her and said that was the point. By then, the legal process had done what money alone could not. Her employment record had been cleared. The cafe manager who had used her name to hide theft had signed a formal statement. The holding company behind the false vacancy push had paid penalties, lost contracts, and withdrawn from 2 pending acquisitions after Ethan made certain. The quiet parts were dragged into daylight. He had never asked for praise for any of it. He had only made sure the damage stopped spreading. Claire stood near the entrance now in a navy dress and a cream coat, greeting guests as founding creative director of Rose House, her name printed on the event program in crisp black letters that still felt strange to see. Children from the neighborhood ran past her toward the reading corner. A retired teacher asked where the watercolor class would meet. A young mother with tired eyes held a toddler on one hip while staring at the apartment key in her hand as if she still expected someone to tell her there had been a mistake. Claire knelt just long enough to show her which staircase led upstairs, and when she rose again, Ethan was there beside her, not above the room, not hidden inside it, simply beside her in a dark suit with his jacket unbuttoned and his expression softer than the city had ever taught him to wear in public. "You built exactly what she hoped for," he said, glancing toward the sketch. Claire followed his gaze and shook her head gently. "We did." The words settled between them with a kind of peace that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. There were still scars in the story. They had learned not to pretend otherwise. She had made him earn back trust one honest day at a time, through meetings, blueprints, late coffee over budget drafts, public accountability, and small choices that mattered more than apologies spoken once in a perfect room. He had done it gladly. Then, when the short dedication ceremony ended and the last round of applause faded into conversation, Ethan reached into his pocket and drew out a single key on a plain silver ring. No velvet box, no spectacle, just a key. Claire looked at it, then at him. "Unit 312 is reserved as staff housing through Rose House," he said. "It is yours for as long as you serve here, with the option to renew after that. No hidden terms." Her breath caught, and for 1 second she was back in the rain, staring at a locked door and a yellow notice, remembering what it felt like to have nowhere to set down your life. Ethan must have seen the memory move through her face, because his voice gentled even more. "I wanted the first door you open here to be one you never have to be afraid of." Claire took the key, her fingers brushing his, and this time she did not pull away. Around them the lobby glowed with voices, pages turning, cups clinking softly from the refreshment table, life beginning in ordinary sounds. "You know," she said, looking up at him with that blue-gray steadiness he had trusted long before he deserved to. "For a man who once hid behind a dishwashing apron, you have gotten surprisingly honest." Ethan laughed under his breath, the sound warm and unguarded. "That is your fault." Claire smiled, and this time the smile stayed. Then she reached for his hand in front of the reading room, the staff, the residents, the children, the whole bright witness of the place their mothers had imagined long before either of them knew how much it would cost to bring it to life. Ethan closed his fingers around hers as naturally as if they had always belonged there, and when he spoke, he did not lower his voice, did not tuck the feeling away where it could remain safe and unfinished. "I recognized the drawing first," he said, "but somewhere between that train station and this building, I realized you felt like home." Claire looked at the framed sketch, at the open doors, at the people moving through the space as if they had been expected all along, and then back at the man who had once watched her lose everything and had chosen, in the end, not to save her from a distance but to stand beside her while she rebuilt. "Then stay," she said softly. Ethan did not answer with a promise dressed up in grand language. He answered the way Rose House had answered from the start, by staying, by showing up, and by making love visible in what he chose to protect. He stayed.